Okay, so after having talking about evolution, now we're going to get into the origins of life. And evolution really helps us understand not only the origins of life, well, the origins of life has little to do with evolution, but everything from then, including the diversity of life, um, why different organisms are similar, why different organisms are different, um, how we can account for so many different living things, the biodiversity. All of that is explained and understood within the theory of evolution. And some scientists have famously said nothing in biology makes sense without the understanding of evolution. So we'll talk about the origins of life, we'll go into then the diversity of life, and then we'll also talk about taxonomy. So how do we organize and sort these different things as we know them, define them, and characterize them? All right, so the timeline of life, we won't go all the way back to the Big Bang Theory, which has recently taken on some different developments, but the Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old, okay, and it formed from a hot mass of molten rock. Water came to the Earth shortly after being formed in the form of comets. So if you've ever seen a comet in the sky, it has this large white tail. That is ice. Okay, and so enough comets hit the Earth, tons and tons of comets over millions of years. That accumulates into water on the Earth. The moon formed from a collision of a large protoplanet, so not as large as the Earth itself, but this is still something which is actually kind of being debated. More evidence is coming out. Did the did some planet just get captured and start orbiting the Earth, and that formed our moon, or did some collision, something that hit the Earth and then caused some stuff to go out and around the Earth form the moon? And most of the evidence suggests that there was something hit the Earth and then it made this big old dust ball which coalesced into the moon. Okay, so Earth or living things first occurred on the planet between 3.5 and 3.8 billion years ago. You think about that, that's kind of a big window, but what we found are fossils which date that far back. We don't know exactly when the first one actually started, but somewhere between that time it's estimated. And how they became to be is a bit of a mystery, but the idea is that somehow a cell membrane was formed, and those will naturally form. We can get those to naturally form in nature. An accumulation of amino acids and DNA, nucleic acids, were able to coalesce within this protocell, and somehow it formed a cell. We think this occurred in either the ocean's edge or deep under the sea in very hot kind of underwater geysers called hydrothermal vents, or in conditions like this in the early Earth. We know, or we have estimates of when things happened because of the fossil record and the different layers within the fossil record. And those estimates are based on the half-lives of isotopes. So elements will decay at a certain rate, depending on what type of element they are, into other elements. And we can look at those ratios in different forms of rocks, and we can tell when it was formed and thus estimate the date for them. The oldest known living organisms were about 3.5 billion years ago. And then from there we have eukaryotes. So these are more complex single-celled organisms. That's us. Occurred about 1.5 billion years ago. Multicellular organisms first appeared 1 billion years ago. Animals and plants mostly diversified, or first started diversified about 500 million years ago. Then we have things walking on land, tetrapods, animals, close to 400 million years ago. Mammals, 125 million years ago. A lot of the mammals just kind of didn't represent much in the animals of the world until about 75 million years ago when they diversified. And then once the dinosaurs went extinct, a lot of the niches were filled by mammals after that. Sirenians, so these are whales. Oh no, these are like manatees, occurred 50 million years ago. Whales 40 million years ago. Pinnipeds 20 million years ago. So these are just interesting dates, but aren't necessarily the Sirenian cetaceans and pinnipeds. I have those because I use this in marine biology as well. And then humans first appeared, approximately 10,000 years ago. All right, so we have lots of different diversity of living things. And when we look at this cheeseburger, and we'll reference this again, you can look at all the organisms used to make this. We've got sesame, we've got yeast, which is, we've got cheese, which came from milk. We've got lettuce, which is some type of plant. We've got wheat. There's probably sugar in there as well. So there's a bunch of different things you could name which aren't on here. If you were to take all these organisms and then try and group them in some way, how would you do it? You might do it by color. You might do it by the characteristics of those organisms, like well, can they fly? Can they move on their own? Do they grow in the ground? And we kind of take most of the classification that we have nowadays for granted. For example, we know yeast is not a plant, but a long time ago it might have been thrown in there. We know that both cows and bees are animals. So the science of classifying and putting these things in groups is called taxonomy. So the science of naming and classifying organisms. I have this chart here of killer whales, and we can classify different types of killer whales in different ways. We could say, all right, geographically, we're going to group them together. We could say morphologically, so looking at their physical appearances, there's similarities and differences that we can do. There's lots of different ways then we classify living things. Well, one of the most standard ways is through DNA, but we can also look at different types of proteins that they use. We can look at development and the similarities and differences there. We can look at the fossil record, physical characteristics. Our current form of taxonomy, which was first developed by Carl Linnaeus. He was a scientist who collected lots of organisms and tried to group them. We use this domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species for living things. And we write the species name as both the genus and species name, with the genus name capitalized and the species name lowercase. And they're either underlined or put in italics. So when we'll talk about species, we're talking about the group which interbreeds for the most part, but there are other different ways to define a species. I'll say some examples. Humans are Homo sapiens. The bowhead whale is Balaena mysticetus. One of the things you can do is you can look up, basically Google any organism, from a bacteria to a plant to your spirit animal, and you can find the scientific name and most of the taxonomy just listed on the Wikipedia page. All right, so this is something we'll do in class. All right, here are more examples. You can see the human and the dolphin here. Now, you'll notice here, if we're going to group these, both humans and dolphins are going to be in the same group for a lot of the different things. So they're in the same domain, Eukaryote. They're in the same kingdom, Animalia. They're in the same phylum, Chordata. And then at the class, they're also the same, Mammalia. But then at the order, that's when they diverge. So this order, the order for the dolphin is Cetacea. The order for humans is primates. And this reflects then their evolutionary history. So both dolphins and humans have a similar common ancestor, which is a mammal, a mammalian common ancestor. But primates have a different common ancestor than cetaceans, and that's why they're grouped in different orders there. So understanding evolution also helps us understand how we name and classify organisms. All right, I mentioned species. Species can be defined in a number of different ways. One of the first ways was called the biological species concept, which is species are defined by their ability to breed in the wild. If populations can interbreed naturally, then they are the same species. If they don't, then they are different species. So tigers and lions can make fertile hybrids. You can make a tie-in and a liger. But they don't do this naturally, and number two, those offspring are infertile, so it's not something that can perpetuate. So they would be considered different species according to this this definition. A more universal concept is the phylogenetic species concept, which mostly looks at molecular evidence such as DNA, RNA, amino acids, or proteins. And so we can define species based on their similarity or differences in DNA, usually is what we use. And this is more universal because there are organisms that do not sexually reproduce, like bacteria. So bacteria don't apply to the biological species concept. So we got to use some other marker to determine different species of bacteria. So phylogenetics then is the study of evolutionary relationships in organisms, and you make these phylogenies, okay, these branching trees which show then or hypothesize then similarities and groupings and common ancestry based on the nodes, the points where they come together or diverge. And phylogenies are hypothetical, right? So they are not set in stone. So for example, we've got two phylogenies to the right, which show different relationships between the 5 organisms. In the one on top, sea stars and brittle stars are grouped together. Sea urchins and sea cucumbers are grouped together, and then the feather stars are all by themselves. Whereas in the one on the bottom, sea urchins and sea cucumbers are grouped together, just like they were in the other one. But now all the other ones are separate. So brittle stars are separate from sea stars, which are separate from feather stars. And so these are two different hypotheses. They may be supported looking at different characters. So if you're looking at morphology, maybe the top one is more accurate. If you're looking at DNA, maybe the bottom one is more accurate. And generally, a more accurate one is going to use information from multiple different sources to create those relationships. Okay, I think that's it.